Raise a glass to the past and the ladies cross the ages, fallen fathers from the motherland whose lives are on the pages. And the bard who said it best when he told us all the world's a stage. So fellas, grab a glass and lift your spirits to the seventh age.
Welcome one and all to the Seven Ages Audio Journal. It's time once again to pour up a glass and pull up a chair as we gather together here in our favorite corner of the Cross Time Pub, conducting archaeology on all the four corners of the earth and perhaps also in space. Joining me as always, we have quite a group, quite a crew who have gathered here this week. And of course, the pints are flowing. Good times had by all. As always, Jason Pentrail, environmental scientist extraordinaire, and James Geologist Waldo. Jason, sir, how are you?
Well, spring is upon us. I am coaching soccer for my 5-year-old, so you can imagine what that is like. And, grass needs to be cut, pollen needs to be blown off the driveway, and cars need to be washed.
James, I guess you're just digging in the dirt, aren't you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm enjoying spring, which is my second favorite season, second only to the season you're experiencing now.
Indeed. I, of course, am down here in beautiful Brazil, where I spend a little time each year. It's a pleasure, as always, to be here. And I'm actually hoping to get to the nearby university to speak with the head of the archaeology department. Now, my Brazilian Portuguese isn't that good, but fortunately, I know people. I know folks who can help me with that, and I'd love to be able to do, actually, guys, what might end up being the first interview that we have in another language here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal. I mean, there's so much interest in archaeology all around the world. Why not bring different languages as well as different cultures? What do you guys think?
I think it's a brilliant idea. Take every opportunity, as I say. If you're there in Brazil and someone's willing to teach you and teach us about some of the fascinating sites there, then we should definitely capitalize on that opportunity.
Indeed. But one day that's going to extend even further away from Earth. I got to indulge in interest here for just a moment, guys, because, Pop Science recently carried an article about space archaeology. And this is something that really interests me a lot. As they noted in the article, it's an archaeologist's day job to unearth stories out of the things we leave behind. Earthly possessions and artifacts can give a glimpse into ancient civilizations and even modern-day life. But as humans venture beyond our planet, how do you keep archaeology alive in space? Now, they go into a lot of different things. One might think you're looking at the archaeology of extraterrestrial civilizations. As interesting as that would be, one of the prime locations that will no doubt be of archaeological interest in the future is actually going to be the moon. Archaeologists are going to be very interested in looking at the remnants left by humans on the lunar surface during our past missions there, and, extend that even further on. I mean, right now it's going to be a real trick, even with the help of guys like Elon Musk and SpaceX, to get to Mars. But imagine future generations, it may be much easier for them to traverse the distance between planets and go to planets like Mars, and they're going to go and they're going to look at national monuments like the Perseverance rover. Imagine that for a moment, would you?
Yeah, that's absolutely incredible. And have we seen this year, how many launches did we have into space, going to Mars, going to various places, the James Webb Telescope? So our reach is getting bigger, our influence is getting bigger, and the thought of space archaeology, even there on the moon, is a fascinating concept, I think.
Indeed. And also, I'll point out, our reach here at Seven Ages is getting bigger just as well. Jason, I know you have been leading the charge with our Patreon. Why don't you give us a quick update about what's been going on over there?
Yeah, absolutely. So again, we do have an active Patreon now called the Cross Time Pub. That is our special Patreon show. And then we also have special features on there, such as our Digging Deeper series, our Landmarks of the World series, and we have a lot of new things coming here in the next few months for our Patreon subscribers. You can find that at patreon.com/7agespodcast, or you can just go over to Patreon and search for 7 Ages Podcast. It will come up there for you. We have several episodes of the Cross Time Pub available for you, along with those special features. We're going to be adding to that in the coming months. And so far, we've had a good reception. I want to thank every single person who's gone over there and joined us on Patreon, been shooting me some messages, interacting with us over there, and it's just great to see the outreach and support for the show. It really means a lot to us. Our team here really depends on the funds that are donated to the show through Patreon to get out there and bring you the very best in archaeology. So again, thank you to all of our patrons who have joined us there at patreon.com/7 Ages Podcast.
Indeed. We, of course, will also have that linked in the show notes. I got to thank you guys, by the way. You've been doing a fantastic job there managing the Patreon. I was even a guest on a recent episode. And ladies and gents, let me assure you, it's the least you will have ever heard me say ever on a podcast. That's because these guys do such a good job all by themselves. They hardly need me, in fact. But I've got another idea. In fact, I hope to actually contribute something there on the Patreon in the days ahead, because I might just go get lost in the jungles of Brazil and just see what happens, right? Get to know the, get to know the natives. And in fact, if I make it back, the plan would be, of course, I'll have my my field mic, right? Because I'm going to be in the field, and I'll record everything, batteries and their endurance willing, and I'll report back to you guys. Speaking of endurance, by the way, am I mistaken in my understanding that Endurance, the famed ship of Sir Shackleton, was actually rediscovered?
That seems to be the case. Yeah, according to the BBC and author Jonathan Amos, the Endurance, Shackleton's lost ship, is found in the Antarctic. Now, if you've seen the video, there is a great clear video of this. If you've seen the video, it is truly remarkable. The particular vessel that we're talking about is the famed vessel of Sir Ernest Shackleton, and it was found in the bottom of the Weddell Sea. So we're talking about 1915. Of course, the ship was crushed by ice and it sank. It forced Shackleton and his men to make that astounding escape, that intrepid story that we've all heard so many times. It's absolutely incredible. But if you look at the 10,000 foot deep vessel, it is in immaculate condition. It's truly, truly beautiful. That ice cold water has kept it well preserved, and it is really something to behold, and it really, really captures the imagination. So the project to find the lost ship was mounted by the Falklands Maritime Heritage Museum, or Trust rather, using a South African icebreaker, and they were able to locate it. They were able to get cameras down there on it. The water was perfectly clear, and there is the Endurance sitting right on the bottom of the ocean in beautiful, pristine condition, an absolutely incredible archaeological find.
That is incredible. You know, I love those shipwrecks, but the ancient shipwrecks are even more interesting. Did you guys know that there are very few sailing vessels older than 8,000 years that are known to historians or archaeologists? Now, here's what I propose. Let's try and mount an archaeological excavation up there at the top of Mount Ararat, where even the CIA took interest in that purported Ararat anomaly back in the day. Now, I don't know if that's actually what some claim it to be, but the story goes that Mount Ararat, of course, is one of the possible locations where the famous Ark of the Old Testament may have landed. Make of that what you will, but there are those stories, ladies and gents, of there being some sort of a strange, very large wooden structure up there. Even the CIA took photos with spy planes back in the 50s. Kind of a fascinating story. And by the way, of course, you can get the entire story about 7 Ages, our entire back catalog of podcasts, and find out all the places to follow us online over there at 7ages.org. Don't forget to look for us on Twitter, on Instagram, on Facebook. Jason runs our Facebook page, does a fine job. And of course, I would be remiss if I didn't mention our fine affiliates, all of the folks out there who support our work. And at the very top of that list, we have the Smoky Mountain Relic Room and Chase Pipes, one of my very favorite people who, as I understand it, has been looking for Tennessee diamonds in recent days. Jason, would you get us up to speed on what's been happening over there at the Smoky Mountain Relic Room?
Well, as we all know, Chase never sits still, maybe ever. I don't know if he ever sits still. But in this particular case, he was able to stay close to home. He didn't have to travel halfway across the country. The Herkimer diamond, it's really a crystal, but that's what it's called. It's local there to his region. In fact, it's found very, very close to his home. And he was able to get out there and collect some of these fine specimens, not only for his personal collection, but also available at the Relic Room. So again, remember, the Relic Room is recently renovated. It's much bigger. They have much more room for crystals and minerals and all of the wonderful things that they have available for everyone over there, including dinosaur bones, shark's teeth, and all sorts of fantastic treasures. So the Herkimer diamonds are also available there now at the store. You can find that in Sevierville, Tennessee, inside the Smoky Mountain Knife Works, or at therelicroom.com. Again, it's the largest diversity of history for sale in North America.
Yes, indeed. Definitely check them out. And of course, while you're at it, look for Chasing History on YouTube, because Chase does fantastic work, Great videos that document his travels, kind of like Seven Ages does. He's a definite favorite of ours and a very, very good friend. And speaking of favorites, I love artifacts. I love the mysterious aspects of archaeology when it comes to ancient America. And so when we return here in a moment, we've got quite a conversation coming up because we will be joined by Austin Bell, who's going to be discussing the Marco Island cat right here on the Seven Ages Audio Journal. Great conversation lined up tonight. Austin Bell is curator of collections at the Marco Island Historical Society and a consulting scholar at the University of Pennsylvania Museum. In addition to his specializations in exhibit development, collections management, and material culture studies, Austin is passionate about preserving and sharing Florida's history and, of course, to be a steward of its cultural heritage. Now, he's the author of 3 books, one of which we'll be talking about tonight, that deal with the history and heritage of Marco Island. That book is The 9 Lives of Florida's Key Marco Cat, published by the University Press of Florida. So without further ado, welcome to the program, Austin Bell. How are you?
Hey guys, I'm doing great. Thank you so much for having me. It's my pleasure to be here.
Yeah, Austin, well, thank you for joining us. I have to say, I get the newsletters and the catalogs from the Florida University Press. And when I saw your book come across that catalog, that captivating photo of the Key Marco cats there, and he's just staring at you with those eyes, and immediately bought the book and was excited to get it in the mail, started reading through it. And it's so unique in North American archaeology that it really does sort of captivate the reader. And just looking at such a unique specimen, you find yourself almost obsessed with it. So I started reading everything I could find about it as I went through the book, checking some of the references and things just to learn more about it. And so with that being said, I know you had a very similar experience with this particular artifact. So let's begin from your college experience and then move into how you eventually became the curator at the Marco Island Historical Society. So take us back to your college years.
Sure. So I went to the University of Florida, actually originally as an aerospace engineering major. And I quickly learned that I wasn't going to hack it in physics. And so I turned to a major that I really had a passion for, rather than something that other people, sort of wanted me to do for a career. And that was anthropology, and specifically archaeology. And so I, crammed in as much as I could in the last 2 years after I changed my major, and ended up going to an archaeological field school and volunteering at the Florida Museum of Natural History, where I got a part-time job as a collections assistant, and just helping to sort and process archaeological materials. And then they kicked me out the door, and I got a job as what is affectionately known in the business as a shovel bum in the cultural resource management world, and did that for about 1.5 years, doing surveys along pipeline corridors in Ohio and Louisiana and Florida. And then the economic downturn of 2008 actually ended up causing myself and some of my fellow coworkers to lose our jobs. And so I found myself back at the museum in Gainesville volunteering. And again, they found some paid work for me that added up to some, enough to get by while I worked on going back to school, because I decided, that what I really wanted to do was work in museums. I had enjoyed that experience as an undergrad, and I wanted to go back to school for museum studies, so kind of getting away from the archaeology a little bit and focusing more generally on museum exhibits and collections work. And so I continued to work part-time at the Florida Museum of Natural History while I was a master's student. And it was there that I was first introduced really to the Key Marco artifacts, actually by being assigned to inventory them. They were actually being moved to another part of the museum at that time. And so I had to go through and carefully identify and inventory each one, make a huge spreadsheet, and then help with the transfer of these extremely fragile materials. And of course, that's when I first became super interested in the cat, as well as all these other, really remarkable artifacts that came from Marco Island, which, I had never been to Marco Island before I started working here. But in 2013, when I had just finished up my master's degree, I had heard about, through my advisor, a position opening up in Marco Island at a new museum there. And the focus of their exhibits was going to be primarily the Key Marco artifacts. And so it kind of seemed a little bit predetermined, and I feel very fortunate to have been able to come here to Marco Island and been available at that time to do so. So anyway, that's how I wound up here studying the Key Marco artifacts. And I'd spend the next, as we'll get to, I spent the last 10 years here almost working toward getting the cat on loan and developing exhibits around it. So
yeah. Well, I think it's very fortunate and synchronistic the way that you ended up working with those artifacts and then later to become the position that you are now in such an influential position to be an overseer of those artifacts. But just so that everyone in the listening audience is on board with us here as we're discussing these, please give us a description of exactly where Key Marco is in Florida.
So Marco Island is actually what was once known as Key Marco is called now. The Key Marco site, Key Marco is the name of an archaeological site. It was really dubbed that by the archaeologist who excavated it in 1896. If you come to Marco Island now, the area that's known as Old Marco Village is really all that Key Marco archaeological site. And so we're located in Southwest Florida, just south of Naples, which is just south of Fort Myers, and we're straight across the Tamiami Trail from Miami, just to give people an idea of where Marco Island is in Southwest Florida.
Okay, very good. And now to give due diligence to the Marco Island artifacts or the Key Marco artifacts, the cat obviously will be, the center of discussion for this evening, but the other artifacts that are part of that collection, can you give us a quick description of what exactly those artifacts are and kind of what the materials are, what makes up that collection?
Yeah, so it's an incredibly unique collection, and really one that hasn't been duplicated since its discovery in 1896. It consists of incredibly fragile organic materials. Many of them are made from wood and plant fiber and gourds and other materials that just don't ordinarily survive in archaeological sites. And so we've got animal figureheads, we've got carved wooden masks, we've got actual netting used by the Caloosa and their ancestors that you can still see the knots in there, and all sorts of wooden material culture that really represents an important part of daily life that you otherwise just are lacking from typical archaeological sites. It gives you a clearer picture, more representative picture of what people were using in day-to-day life here in Southwest Florida.
Indeed, many of these artifacts are also recognized as some of the most beautiful that really have been found, especially on the East Coast, maybe anywhere in North America. But can we also talk a bit about the history? Going back to the 19th century, the early Smithsonian excavations that occurred in the late 19th century, and the area known as the Court of the Pile Dwellers.
Yes, so as I was kind of alluding to, the site was excavated in 1896 by a guy named Frank Hamilton Cushing, and he was a curator for the Smithsonian Institution. And he dubbed a section of the Key Marco site the Court of the Pile Dwellers. And it was basically sort of a muck pit in a low-lying area that was waterlogged, in which all of these organic materials and other artifacts as well had been deposited and sealed in sort of an oxygen-free anaerobic environment for centuries. And so they were first excavated actually by the landowner, W.D. Collier, who lived on Marco Island, was an entrepreneur and has a long history here. We detail in our museum, but he was the first person to find them. But then it actually, and I'll get into this later, I'm sure, but a series of events led Cushing to come to Marco Island from actually Philadelphia, where he was visiting the Penn Museum at one time.
There's a bit of a mystery right there with regard to this court of the pile dwellers. What were the circumstances? Obviously, we won't know because this happened centuries ago, but what were the circumstances under which we think that this batch of artifacts might have been so well preserved as they were?
So there are a few theories on why, these artifacts, many of them were in pristine condition. And I should have mentioned earlier that a lot of the wooden artifacts were actually painted, and the paint was still visible. The pigments were still visible on the artifacts when they were unearthed. They came out of the ground almost like new. And so, it begs the question, why would these be just thrown in the mud? And the answer is that it probably wasn't intentional. It was probably some sort of dramatic, maybe even, tragic event. And there are several theories as to what might have caused that. The predominant one is that some sort of hurricane, which is part of daily life, especially during the summer here in Marco Island. A hurricane swept through, and the storm surge, knocked the buildings that housed these materials off their platforms and into the mud, and then were kind of suppressed by the upper structures, and kind of because there were timbers and other sort of building materials and thatch found in amongst these artifacts as well. And so that is one theory, but there could have also been some sort of fire event. Some of the artifacts were burned, and then there's also, the possibility that there was some sort of invasion, and the structures were intentionally destroyed either by the invaders or the people that were fleeing the area. So I think the most popular theory, though, is the storm-induced deposition.
That's very interesting, and I'm curious, and I'm sure the listeners are, and I know the rest of us are here. Hey, what kind of material are the artifacts made out of, specifically the wooden ones, and how were they discovered? I can almost guess probably building or something that they were dredged up that way, but
sure. So it's interesting. We don't actually know what kind of wood the Key Marco cat in particular is made from. It's sometimes reported as buttonwood, but that's not necessarily true. In the book, I kind of go into the possibilities, and I think I listed about 22 different possibilities of the species type, some more likely than others. Most of the items from the Key Marco site were made of cypress or pine, but there were certainly other species represented as well. But the thing about the cat is it's such a unique object, and in order to really identify the types of wood species, you have to do what's called destructive analysis, where you take a small, thin section of the artifact and examine it under a microscope. And so they did that with a number of artifacts from a couple of museum collections to identify these various types, but of course never did it to the Key Marco cat. And as far as how were they discovered, well, as I mentioned, W.D. Collier, he was an entrepreneur here on Marco Island in the late 1800s and early 1900s. And so one of his enterprises was the production of horticulture. He grew fruits and vegetables and shipped them down to Key West. And so he was actually using this muck from the court of the pile dwellers as fertilizer for his gardens. And so one day when he was digging around in the muck, trying to gather it up to feed his crops, he noticed some objects that looked like they were probably made by human hands. And so he kind of spread the word about this, but there were some amateur archaeologists sort of vacationing in the area, in the Naples area. One of them was Lieutenant Colonel C.D. Durnford. He was a lieutenant colonel in the British Army, and he was, I think, tarpon fishing, which was a very popular sporting activity back then. Tarpon fishing in the area, caught wind of the discoveries that Collier and others had made, and went down to look at the site himself, found some of the materials, asked Collier if he could have them, and he said yes. So he took him up to the University of Pennsylvania Museum, where he expected to meet curator friend of his there, but he wasn't there. And instead, Cushing was there actually visiting his personal physician, a total coincidence. Cushing looked at him, took one look and realized what they were, how important they were, and eventually secured permission to head the expedition down to Florida. Meanwhile, Durnford kept his artifacts and actually donated them to the British Museum in London. And so before Cushing actually ever even excavated here on Marco Island, Durnford deposited his in one of the most famous museums in the world. And so you've got Key Marco represented overseas, even in a small collection of wooden artifacts there. And so that's what led Cushing, though, to ultimately come here on a larger expedition. Well, first a reconnaissance expedition and then a larger one that followed.
Yeah, that's super interesting, and it's quite a series of coincidences to sort of, get that, make those things kind of unfold, like the events unfold like they did. And one thing I forgot to ask you about was, you mentioned that many of the objects were painted when they came out of the muck. They were still largely intact. And I was curious, do we have any idea what was the composition of the paint? Was it like an ochre type thing, or was it more like an organic pigment from berries or plants?
Those are all great guesses, and the only thing we don't know for sure. There's been some experimental archaeology done, trying to replicate pigments. Robin Brown, who's written a couple books on Southwest Florida archaeology, did a really great job and used both ochre and berries and mixed them with sap and other materials to try to replicate the process, creating, he carved artifacts using shell tools and painted them with these pigments that he derived from nature. So we don't know for sure, but I think those are both great possibilities.
Yeah, and it's those details that really set these artifacts apart. And as we now turn the conversation a little bit more focused on the cat itself, I would encourage everyone listening to do a quick search, pull up a picture of this cat, because as we get into this conversation of this particular artifact, it's key to understand the positioning of it, the size of it, the detail of it, because it really is a remarkable piece, and it's something that you need to see so that you can follow along with the rest of the conversation here. And with that in mind, the particular artifact of the Key Marco cat stands kind of as the centerpiece of this collection, although the other parts of the collection are equally impressive in many ways. Turning to the book and the introduction, I want to relay this small piece from the introduction. Quote, "In the realm of North American archaeology, few artifacts hold as much power and mystique as Florida's wooden Key Marco cat statuette. Indeed, given the antiquity of North America's native people living on the continent for thousands of years prior to its invasion from Europe, and given that most material culture recovered from North American archaeological sites is refuse, relatively few such items of true transcendent nature have survived to present day." So with that in mind, Austin, please give us a good detailed description of exactly the positioning and the details of the Key Marco cat.
Sure. So the cat is just a 6-inch tall statuette. As you mentioned, it's what anthropologists consider to be anthropomorphic, meaning it has both human and animal-like characteristics. And the animal that it most probably represents is a feline, and again, most probably the native Florida panther to this area. And it was probably carved with shark tooth tools and other tools at least 500 years ago, if not more, by the Caloosa people of Southwest Florida or their ancestors. And it really is a work of art. It's in a crouching position. It's almost perfectly symmetrical from head to toe. And it's really carved with a remarkable delicacy and artistic eye. And it's just a testament to the complexity of the people or person that made it and used it and probably enjoyed it. And so, as I said, it's anthropomorphic. So, its posture, the way it's sitting, that's impossible for cats. To its extremities, there are human-like qualities that are expressed by the wood carver. And so those might, indicate a possible extra level of importance. And, so some people have suggested that it's an actual representation, a literal representation of a masked performer or costume performer. And other people believe it's sort of in a state of transformation somewhere between human and feline, but not explicitly both. And, as a work of art, I kind of see it as, it's something a little ambiguous and, makes sense. It makes sense as a work of art to me.
Sure. And when we look at the other portions of the collection from Key Marco, from that site, is there anything else comparable from the anthropomorphic standpoint, or is this sort of a standalone artifact amongst that collection?
It's interesting. There is a human figure represented by a small wooden carving, and that is often thought to be wearing a mask as well. But it is also thought to be laying on its back, possibly some sort of blanket or something. There's a rectangular piece behind it. But most of the other animal representations are not anthropomorphic per se. They're more naturalistic and representing, for example, a deer. There's a pelican figurehead. There's a figurehead that's either a turtle or a bird, depending on who you ask. And we've had a number of these items, which still are actually in remarkably good condition, on loan here to the Marco Island Historical Museum.
Sure. And when you look at this striking object, it draws parallels to Egyptian iconography and the gods and goddesses that we see from that particular culture. I'm not saying those are associated, but that's what it puts me in mind of, is that sort of representation. So that leads me to think, is there anything else from the Caloosa or from any of the other surrounding cultures that would be indicative of that human hybrid type of approach to a god or goddess type of worship? Or also something else that it put me in mind of is there any association between those cultures and what we would consider to be the Mississippian Southern cult, with those very strong, indicative sort of iconography, gods and goddesses such as the Birdman and things like that? Are there any connections there at all?
Yeah, there may well be, but again, it's hard to say for sure. And there's people on both sides of the aisle, really, in this discussion. And I should say, I'm not, I don't consider myself an archaeologist. So anything in the book is based on archaeology of others. I try to lay out all the different possibilities in the book and side by side for equal consideration.
Do we see anything comparable to that as far as their archaeology or gods and goddesses, that sort of thing?
Right. So there are some other figures that sort of resemble the Key Marco cat. The most obvious one is the Rollins College cat, which is so called because it's in the collections at Rollins College in Central Florida. And it's sort of a even more slender, but it's a fragmented piece, and so you don't get the whole picture. But it's much more probably naturalistic than the Key Marco cat, a little less human-like, but it is definitely representative of a cat and made of wood. And then we've got others on the other end of the spectrum that are a little more human-like, but with some really subtle feline characteristics. The Mahoney figurine and the Paget figurine, both of which were recovered around Lake Okeechobee, which is really nearby here in South Florida. And then, of course, you've got artifacts from another famous site nearby, Fort Center, and a number of animal carvings and were recovered from that site in a mortuary pond. And that is generally thought to be a little earlier than Key Marco in age. But again, there's a lot of controversy over the age of the Key Marco artifacts. And so there is a very broad range that we generally ascribe to it. And to answer the second part of your question about, whether it's part of the Mississippian Southern cult, again, as I said, there's people on both sides of this. Generally, I think the further back you go, the more certain people were that the Key Marco artifacts were part of the Southern cult. In fact, they actually used the Key Marco iconography to kind of set the parameters set the definition of the cult. And but as you come more forward in time, the things that tend to define the Southern cult, or what you might call the Southeastern ceremonial complex now, such as platform mounds and iconography around warfare and the sun due to reliance on agriculture, those not necessarily, especially the platform mounds, are being recognized as possibly being woodland. And so again, it kind of goes back to how old the artifacts are. It's not just relying on radiocarbon dates, which are controversial, but stylistically, some of the other finds at the Key Marco site include a shell gorget with a cross design, possibly representing 4 cardinal directions. And then you've got items that have this sort of spider motif. There's a number of them found throughout Florida, and generally those are thought to be indicative of the Southeastern ceremonial complex. And you've got artifacts like that found in the Key Marco site, but you've also got these sort of more naturalistic depictions of animals, which is typically a more woodlands association. And then you've got controversial radiocarbon dates going back well into the woodland period as well. So it's a long-winded answer to your question, and it probably didn't settle much. But as I said, I'm kind of relying on the works of many people here who have been studying this for far longer than I have, and certainly respect both sides of the aisle here. And I don't really see so far a way to definitively say one or the other, but it's interesting to think about, and hopefully will stimulate further exploration and discussion of that issue.
While we've been doing the interview, as I often do, I go down the rabbit hole of Google Photos and all types of different things to check out the artifacts and collections and all that. And I noticed that, and I don't know if it says it's the Key Marco collection. It's actually University of Florida's Pinterest page. There's a conch shell that appears to have some type of slightly decayed wood sort of inserted in the top of it. And it looks like the conch shell itself is highly worn, and a lot of it's missing. But I was curious, do we know what the use of that artifact is, if it's actually part of the collection?
Yeah. So one note about the collections, the Key Marco collection is split up between the Smithsonian, the University of Pennsylvania, and the Florida Museum of Natural History. That's a long story that I guess I won't get into, but the artifact that you're mentioning is a shell tool. It's probably a lightning whelk, I'm guessing, and would have had a wooden handle hafted to it and probably been used as sort of a chopping or cutting tool. There are actually 52 different types of shell tools identified in Southwest Florida archaeological sites. So some were for pounding and crushing, and some were for smoothing and planing, and others were for more, for chopping, say to cut out a dugout canoe. But those artifacts kind of get lost in the sauce a little bit, those more utilitarian things, when compared to these spectacular items like the Key Marco cat. But they tell us just as much, if not more, about life ways and how the Caloosa made their living and lived their lives. So I'm really glad you pointed that out.
And when we're discussing the Caloosa, we've mentioned that several times, but for the sake of building the narrative around the cat itself, what do we know about the Caloosa? So, what is their cultural standards? What is sort of the norms across that culture? And do we even know for sure that it comes from the Caloosa? Were they on the Key Marco Island at the time?
Yeah, that's a great question. And to answer that part first, no, we don't know if they were on Marco Island at that time because we don't know when that time was. But the Caloosa are generally known as one of the most powerful, if not the most powerful, Native American society in Florida at the time of the arrival of Europeans. And they controlled pretty much all of South Florida at that time. And they interacted with groups as far away as other places in the Southeast. There were as far away as Missouri, I was going to say. They've had evidence of trade at sites not here on Marco Island, but up further north at Pineland. and near Mound Key, which was the Caloosa capital. And the Caloosa are really unique because they basically, we talked about the Southeastern Ceremonial Complex, and a lot of that iconography is based around the sun and agriculture and the importance of maize in becoming a complex society. But the Caloosa were able to become a complex society without a reliance on agriculture. Instead, they were a fishing culture, and so they made their living in the sea and in the estuaries, and were able to live here comfortably year-round without agriculture. Of course, they had small gardens and things like that, but as you can see from their artwork, and as we hear about from the ethnohistoric record, they were really a complex people with distinct social classes, and really dominated even after the Europeans first arrived. They mortally wounded Juan Ponce de Leon and continued to live in the area for a couple hundred years before they ultimately succumbed to disease and slave raids and just warfare and general chaos in the southern part of the peninsula. But on Marco Island specifically, it's interesting because if you look at the pottery from this area, from Key Marco and other sites on Marco Island, it's actually a little bit different than what you see at Pineland and Mound Key to the north, especially before about 1300. And there's unique glades designs, is what they're called, known as the Glades region in archaeology. And the Caloosahatchee region is just to the north. And so the distinction there it lies in the pottery and the unique designs that you see in the Glades region versus Caloosahatchee, and also the composition of the pottery as well. And so those two things start to look more similar, though. After about 1300, 1350, the pottery in both areas looks the same, and you see similar or the same types at both sites, be it Pineland and Key Marco. And so that lends archaeologists to believe that around that time, the Caloosa probably came to control, if not replace, the people on Marco Island, or perhaps allied with them. But, that's what we can learn from the pottery. Otherwise, there's not much difference in the material culture. The shell tools are really the only other thing that survive, except for these remarkable sites like Key Marco, where you get all this organic material. And that's why the Key Marco iconography is kind of ubiquitous throughout Florida, really, because you don't get that at any other sites. And so you'll see Key Marco artifacts on display from Tallahassee to Key West, and they've kind of taken on this. The Caloosa have been attributed, the artifacts have been attributed to the Caloosa more than any others, but may in fact have been made by Glades people, which of course we don't know what they called themselves prior to Europeans arriving. So it's just again another mystery. But I think generally the people in the peninsula were probably more diverse than we generally think of. We just think of the Caloosa controlled this territory, and the Tequesta controlled this territory, but there were probably diverse groups of people in between as well. So,
oh yeah, well, as we know, it's always more complicated than we think just looking at it superficially. Now, that does lead me down another line of questioning, though. But being that the Caloosa, as you just described, are a fishing culture, seafaring culture, making their living, making their foods and nourishments off of the sea and the surrounding areas, it kind of makes the cat itself to be that much more of a mystery, because you would think that if they were getting sustenance from the sea and from the estuaries and things like that, that any type of god or goddess type of statuary would be representative of something from the sea. So my question is, being that it is in a feline form, is there any other species of feline in that area of Florida that would have been present at the time other than the Florida panther? Are there bobcats, lynx, anything like that could also be attributed to the anthropomorphic design of the Key Marco cat?
Yeah, the only other cat species that I know of is the bobcat, and they still live here as well. And actually, there was a mask that Cushing thought was a matching component, possibly to the cat, that he interpreted specifically as a bobcat. So, it's possible that, and I think I mentioned in the book that it's possible that it's not a panther. It could be a bobcat, or people have come into the museum and said straight to my face, "This doesn't look like a cat at all. Why do you call it the Key Marco cat? It looks more like a squirrel, or it looks more." I had one person tell me that it looks more like a species of bat, which I quickly Googled and found lived in the opposite part of the world, and so I was a little reassured that it couldn't have been that species. But it's still, I'm very open-minded, and it's open to interpretation as a work of art. But I think in all likelihood, if it had a spiritual connotation, and it probably did, it was more an item of religious importance and possibly representative of warfare or some other important part of daily life and worshipped as such. And so, I don't know that it was just art for art's sake.
Another thing that fascinates me a bit about this is the fact that there appears to have been a unique preservation method used for this cat figurine, and that involves a bath of glycerin, if memory serves. Can you talk about what historical evidence led you to conclude that this might be what Cushing actually dipped this cat in?
Yeah, so a lot of people comment on just how well preserved it appears to be, even in comparison to the other Key Marco artifacts. It's very shiny and well preserved. And Cushing, when he recovered it, attributed its condition to being slathered with the fat or blood of slain animals, possibly. But that's total, speculation on his part. Not that he didn't have precedent for it, having lived with the Zuni for a good period of time, and but it's not something that we can necessarily prove. But interestingly, when I was doing research for the exhibit at the museum, and then of course this book, I found evidence in correspondence that probably the reason that it's so well preserved now, 120 plus years after it was recovered, is that Cushing was concocting a preservative bath for all of the artifacts because he was so concerned with their deterioration. Many of them disintegrated on the spot. Many more have disintegrated since, just sitting in museum drawers because they're so fragile and had been waterlogged. And of course, the science at the time wasn't there to help preserve these things. And so he was basically doing it on the fly, trying to invent ways to preserve what he called the choicest specimens. And I believe he did perfect that based on the correspondence I've seen, and then likely dipped the Key Marco cat in the bath because condition reports, they indicate a waxy residue inside the deep cracks or recesses on the cat, and you can see him with a hand lens pretty easily just looking at the figure. And so that is more likely to be from his glycerin bath than it is, the what he called the fat of slain animals. So he never said that directly, that he, preserved the cat in a glycerin bath. But again, it was kind of, that sort of practice wasn't necessarily established at the time. In the early days of archaeology, a lot of times objects were even replicated to look like new, when nowadays, if you have a bowl, a ceramic vessel, for instance, you have a different color for the portion of the bowl that is artificial. And back then, sometimes they tried to make it look like new. And so anyways, it was just an interesting discovery, and probably the reason that it's been in such good condition now and has been on exhibit for so long without really obtaining any damage.
Yeah. I mean, an early process, an early attempt. Archaeologists would do things very differently now, but nonetheless, maybe that actually helped in the preservation of some of these, very important artifacts.
Yeah, and I wish there was a way to test which ones have been preserved and which ones haven't, other than just, there's a pile of dust in one drawer and then there's a whole intact artifact in another. That's kind of the most obvious, but it would have been nice if he had let us know which ones, he experimented on and which ones he didn't. But it was interesting some of the artifacts have been treated with pesticides because that's common practice in museum storage for the past, especially the early part of the last century. And so we did an XRF scan of the key marker cat prior to its loan here to the museum and did find evidence of metals that are common in pesticides. And so we know the cat was likely treated with those, as were the other artifacts. And there's some controversy about that around how it could have impacted the radiocarbon dates on some of the other artifacts as well. But it's interesting, the scientific tools that we have available now, and we have these legacy collections that are decades, if not older, and some of these new technologies can help us answer very obscure questions that we might not have even thought to ask 100 years ago. So it's really exciting to me.
Absolutely. Yeah, the technology is opening our eyes every year as it's becoming more and more advanced. So the future of archaeology is certainly exciting. But, Austin, it's not every day that we get the opportunity to speak with someone from the museum side of the house. We work with archaeologists and other types of scientists all the time, but you are certainly the first person that we've had that has a degree in museum studies and understands the museum side of the house. So as we wrap up here tonight on our discussion about the Key Marco cat, discuss the curation history of the cat. Where has it been? Where is it now? And where is it going?
Sure. Yeah, this was probably the most exciting thing for me to research, just because it's really in my wheelhouse. And, one of the most common things I would hear on Marco Island from our visitors or our stakeholders is that cat belongs here, and it's been locked away in a drawer for 100 years, and it's from Marco Island. It should be here. And I never had any evidence to argue against that, even though, I know the Smithsonian was taking great care of it. But I soon armed myself with a surprising amount of information about its exhibit history. And it actually has been on display more than half of the 100 years, actually about 60% of its life as a museum object. It's been on exhibit, which is shockingly long for such a fragile item. As I said, probably protected by that glycerin bath. But as early as 1913, it was on display in the National Museum on the Mall in Washington, D.C., and it was there until at least 1956, and then went back on display for another 22 years when they renovated that hall at the Smithsonian in 1962. And then after that, since 1985, the cat's been part of 7 different exhibits at 11 different locations around the country, including the National Gallery of Art, the Detroit Institute, the Houston Museum of Fine Arts. You've got the Collier County Museum here in Naples. It actually was loaned to a local bank here on Marco Island in 1999-2000 for a Millennium exhibition. And then it was part of a traveling exhibit show, went from Chicago to St. Louis, back to the Smithsonian again. And it's been at the Peabody Essex Museum, all part of Native American art exhibits. And it's been interesting to see how the disciplines of anthropology and art history and museum studies have evolved over the past century, and sort of the interpretation around the cat, how it's changed because of that, has been really cool to look at. And it's been part of probably one of the most ambitious exhibits ever. Was the circa 1492 exhibit at the National Gallery of Art. More than 500,000 people came to see it on display as a representative item of the Americas. This was a global exhibit, and it was one of just a few items from the Americas on display there, next to, not next to, but nearby works by Da Vinci and Michelangelo and other European Renaissance artists. And so it's just really remarkable. And it's even been on, a postage stamp, 1989 postage stamp. So it's become something of, a national treasure. And it'll go back to the Smithsonian in April 2026, and we'll be sad to see it go. But I'll be excited, though, too, because I'm sure it'll be on exhibit again. And, when it's on exhibit at a place like the Smithsonian, more people have the opportunity to see it. It's great for the local people to be able to see it, but it is a national treasure, and deserves to be seen by people all over the world, not just Marco Island.
It's very evident that this artifact has captured so many people's minds, and I'm very delighted to hear how it has, in many literal ways, represented American art, going well back into prehistory. Please tell folks, once again, where they can find your book, where arguably they will learn more about this single enigmatic piece of artwork from the ancient past than any place else.
Sure. So you can go to the University Press of Florida website. You can also find it, I believe, on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or anywhere that books are generally sold online. Or if you're local and come to the Marco Island Historical Museum, where the proceeds will benefit the museum and the Historical Society. And then you'll also have the opportunity to see the real thing, the Key Marco cat, on loan from the Smithsonian, and also artifacts on loan from the Penn Museum. And they'll be here with us for another 4 years until April 2026.
Guys, I think we got to head to Florida. Thank you again, Austin. It's been fantastic talking with you here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Likewise, guys. Thank you so much for having me. It's been a great pleasure.
Austin Bell arguably has become the expert on the Marco Island cat, and my gosh, he told us so much more about that than I even knew. Of course, we'll have a link to where you can find his book there in the show notes. Please support his research and also the museum because, Jason, as you pointed out, I think that was the first time we've actually had a curator here on the program, the other side of archaeology, if you will.
It was indeed. And so, yeah, Austin was able to give us some real insight to not only the archaeological side of things, but the museum side of things. We learned about the curation history of this fantastic artifact. And I think it's something that's very unique to the history of Florida and certainly to the 7 Ages Audio Journal.
Absolutely is. Well, I tell you what, guys, I don't know if you know this, you probably do. I happen to be the curator of a little museum of my own. It's called the Crosstime Pub, and my job here is I actually pour the pints. And so I think it's about time for us to pony up and enjoy one of those together here, guys, as we round out another edition of the program. Thanks as always, Jason, for the hard work you do. James Waldo, you as well. And of course, Austin Bell for telling us all about the Marco Island cat. I am Micah Hanks. We are the 7 Ages Research Associates, and we thank all of you for supporting our work. Follow us online at 7ages.org, and we will catch you next time right here on the 7 Ages Audio Journal.